Welcome to the Expansive CEO podcast. I'm your host, Hannah Chapman, founder of Expansive CEO and X Squared Wealth Planning. Buckle in as we explore how to create true prosperity and build a business and a life that expands beyond yourself and makes a dent in the universe. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the Expansive CEO podcast. I am your host, Hannah Chapman, and this is the next installment of Investment Friday, and I'm here with Brad Haines, the Chief Investment Officer of Juncture Wealth Strategies. Hey, Brad, what's up, man?
Not much. Just living the dream. Just fall is in the air. I know you're in Ohio. I'm in the Mountain West, so fall is starting to come. It was pretty warm for a lot longer than typical, so it's I think it's finally hit with a vengeance.
Yeah, we went from like the 80s, literally like 80s and upper 80s in Cincinnati, like a week and a half ago, and dropped like a rock we had our first couple of freezes overnight, in the last couple days, and highs in the 50s. So it has felt chilly. It's beautiful. Leaves are definitely changing. I can look out the window here and see some trees that look pretty gorgeous. So it's been good. And we have had a relatively, I want to say, normal, stable-ish week in the markets, right? Looking at my phone, checking the my Apple app with all my
Yeah.
stocks. But yeah, it seemed fairly stable this week. Anything happening big there before we get into our topics for today?
Not really. There have been some really great standouts, which is why the market has had a pretty decent week. We're in the midst of the third quarter earnings season, which means that's when all of the larger publicly traded companies announce their earnings results for the third quarter. And we kick it off, and we had some not great earnings from ASML, which is they make the equipment that makes semiconductors. So
Okay.
they're kind of one step removed from the semiconductor process, but they're some of the manufacturers, and they announced pretty poor outlook going forward for the next couple of quarters, and their stock price reflected that. It kind of declined a little bit, and then all of the semiconductors in sympathy went down.
Mm.
Fortunately, that turned around with Taiwan Semiconductor today having great numbers, and really their stock price was appreciating. Similarly with NVIDIA and all the other semiconductor companies that are clients of Taiwan Semiconductor. So it's becoming very interesting that the AI trade, which was pretty much anything semiconductor, is starting to bifurcate a lot between the winners and the losers. Right, ASML had some more difficulty with their business operations in the third quarter, whereas Taiwan Semiconductor did very, very well. So they're part of the winning group. You have Intel still struggling quite a bit to get their arms around where they're going to fit with the AI chip making and the like. And obviously you have NVIDIA, who is the poster child for the AI chips, who make the most sophisticated chips that help AI, or help the capability of AI to work. They've appreciated pretty significantly. So again, we're in the midst of earnings season. The financial companies, Morgan Stanley came out with great numbers. A couple of the banks came out with really good numbers, JP Morgan, Wells Fargo. So we're off to a good start in earnings season this year.
Well, we will keep tabs on that over the next couple of weeks. I know a couple of the companies that my clients work for or have stock in. We're waiting to get some earnings reports over the next couple of weeks from those as well.
Yep.
So we'll keep tabs on that. What is looming right now, we are about 2.5 weeks away at this point, right, is the presidential election in the US. And we have talked about this. I'm not going to say ad nauseum, because it hasn't been all the time, right? But we've hit on this a lot throughout the year. And now that we're getting down to crunch time, we'll say, everyone has just a couple more weeks, right? If your state has early voting, some people have already voted. All of that is in the midst of happening right now. And we've also discussed a couple of weeks ago the Cambridge Analytica, right? Or am I misspeaking? The report. Who did the report? I am like lost in
Well,
the moment.
Cambridge Analytica was in 2016 with
Yes.
Facebook.
Like
So,
that is not the right thing. Um, the comparison between Trump and Harris, economic plans.
the budget model from Wharton and then the tax foundation.
There we go, Wharton, the business school, of course. So we talked about that. We talked about like the overall, like, here's what happens in, Trump's economic plan. Here's what happens in Harris's economic plan as broad strokes, and what, especially the Wharton school was saying were potential outcomes from that. What we want to talk about today more granularly, I think, is what happens if either one of them wins, right? The polling is still fairly close. We don't know who's going to win at this point. And, so what, like from a portfolio standpoint, from an investor standpoint, what are the things that we're going to be looking for? And us, Juncture Wealth Strategies, X Squared Wealth Planning, what are we going to be looking at for clients if Trump wins? And what are we going to be looking at for clients if Harris wins? And the economic plans that they've put in place, there's some that we don't really need to worry about. There's some that will affect, some earners and not others. But from a portfolio management point of view, that's the discussion that I was super interested in having today. So first, Brad, let's go there. Let's say that Trump wins and somehow the House and Senate both flip Republican. Well, the
Okay.
House is already Republican, right? So it stays Republican, the Senate flips Republican. So we've got all three pieces in the Republican control. What might that look like, and what might we do investment wise?
Okay. So if he gets everything that he's promised, or at least said he wants to do, uh, in place, new policies with the tariffs and tax cuts and the like, what is the impact on the economy? How are we going to trade that trend? Um, he's obviously very business friendly from the standpoint of taxes. He wants to come in, he wants to cut taxes on corporate America from 21% to 15%. That's kind of a big deal, right? Because equity markets care about what? They care about profits at the bottom line. And so any growth in profits is going to be rewarded by the equity markets in that way. So equity prices will probably go up. I should say certain equities will go up. Others, companies that have a lot of trade internationally will probably suffer pretty significantly, because if they're doing a lot of business with companies that get hit by tariffs, that's going to slow trade. That's going to slow trade, or if it doesn't, it's going to either decrease their profits, or it's going to increase the price they have to charge their clients. Whether it be a company or the end user, someone has to pay that higher price, or they have to take it out of their profits. Not a great outcome if you're in those companies. Okay. So, one of the things that the Tax Foundation, which is a nonpartisan just research group that crunches the number on taxes. It's, they're the Tax Foundation. They did an analysis and saying, okay, what is the long-term impacts of all of Trump's different proposals? And they said, well, he's going to decrease from today's laws. he will see a decrease in revenue of about $3 trillion over the next 10 years. Okay, so that's about what, 300 billion a year in tax revenues, because again, he's lowering taxes. That means revenues go down. But because of these lower taxes, he's going to probably increase the GDP growth rate, economic growth, by about 0.8%. Now, just to give people understanding, we're at about 2.5 to 3% right now. Okay, so we're looking at increasing it over the long term by 0.8%. All right. He also talks about adding more available jobs. Okay, full-time workers, probably around they said over the next 10 years, about 600,000 new jobs. Now that sounds great. Okay, because I think we all like having more jobs available than less. I just want to remind people, we're coming down from a historically tight labor market where we had 2 jobs available for every 1 person that was unemployed. And that's what helped kind of reinforce this inflationary impact. All right. So I want to make sure that everybody knows that this is a little bit between his tax cuts, which should increase economic growth, and the tariffs, which immediately are a price impact. We could see a lot higher inflation in the short term under the Trump proposals. Now, in the longer term, and that's not very long, very that far out, depending how he implements these tariffs and how aggressive he really does get on these tariffs, you might have people losing jobs in the trade sector and yet be unemployed until, and this is going based on what he has said, is that people will move manufacturing from overseas to the United States, set up factories, and hire new employees. Okay, well, that takes a lot of time. So there's a time element where, these new factories start getting built in the United States, and we hire people from the trade sector into the manufacturing sector. So there's a time element. So there could be quite a bit of upheaval. And so I don't think the Tax Foundation has incorporated all of those metrics and that dynamicism in there into their projection. But again, at the initial blush, it looks like he will be initially better for the economy. Now, also, because he's not cutting spending, at least at this point, he has said he's going to hire Elon Musk as a cost-cutting czar, but we don't know any details about any of the costs he's going to cut, right? He's talked about cutting Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid benefits. He's talked about a couple things, but there's been no definition around that. So they assumed, given today's, that he's going to continue to spend and just have less revenue. So he's going to add a lot more to the federal debt than it is today. Okay. He did that in his first term. He added quite a bit to the federal debt. And then obviously Biden did the same as well, due to COVID and all those types of things. So again, having a fiscal deficit and increasing that deficit is very pro-growth. It's going to generate some economic growth. So he's got lower taxes, which are a pro-growth impulse. You have essentially the impulse from tariffs, which are going to be a negative. Okay, so that's going to drag down a little bit. And then you have the deficit, which again is also pro-growth. So again, that's where they come up with, over the long term, the economic growth should be a little bit higher, but also inflation will be quite a bit higher.
And so when we're talking, what might people be looking at in the stock market? Like, can we talk about that? Can we talk about any of the areas that might
Absolutely.
be hit hardest?
Yeah, absolutely. If Trump gets in and this situation comes about, we will be looking at the portfolios and looking for the companies that will benefit the most from those policies. Okay. There's a lot of companies out there that are great, that will do well under his regime. We want to get on with those companies if we don't own them already. And there may be companies that struggle far more. Maybe they're really reliant upon international trade. Well, if they're hit with those tariffs, those international products they make overseas and then sell into the US, that could be a real problem for their bottom line. So we want to make sure that we identify those companies very, very quickly, minimize the companies that are going to get hurt the most, and maximize our exposure to those companies that will benefit the most during that regime.
So we'll go into, what would happen under a Harris administration. And I want to put a little pin in the global trade, international trade, globalization piece as well. I want to come back to that because I do think it's really important to have an educated conversation around what that means. There is absolutely a case to be made for having, bringing back some levels of manufacturing into the United States. And there's also a pretty substantial argument for, the fact that we are a globalized society at this point. So I don't want to go there just yet. We'll come back to it.
All right.
But I think it's super important. So let's talk about what would it look like under a Harris administration, because we would be looking to make different moves. Let's say Kamala Harris wins, they flip the House and they keep the Senate, right? So we've got Democratic control across all three. What does that look like?
Okay. So, and she gets all of the policies she's announced, she gets it through. Okay. So just to review, she said she's going to let the 2016 tax cuts expire, which expire at the end of this year, which means certain personal income taxes will go up. Okay. Certain capital gains taxes will go up. Okay. So you're going from a 21% to a 28% on tax capital gains. Certain income tax rates will be going up. She's talking about increasing the corporate tax rate from 21 to 28%. She's talking about providing $25,000 for first-time home buyers in terms of down payment help. She's discussing what else? Hold on. There's a couple of other things I wanted to highlight. Oh, that's right. She wanted to, she's floated the wealth tax, the unrealized capital gain tax, out there. And it's for people that are extraordinarily wealthy, over $100 million, but it is part of it. So what is the impact? Okay, well, the impact, again, is relative to today. So I want everybody to realize that when I say these numbers, they're relative to today. Right now, we're growing 2.5% to 3% in GDP, and we have a tight labor market, even though it's been easing a little bit lately. It's still pretty tight. And so I just want to make sure. So the 10-year revenue number is she's going to add $1.7 trillion in revenue. She's going to increase revenue. Obviously, with tax rates going up, it does tend to bring in more revenue. Okay. What it does is it lowers economic growth. Okay. It does that because now the money's going away from the private economy. It's going into the government for the government to pay its bills and to pay the debt. That will probably lower long-run wage growth. Okay. Which wage growth, we have to remember, it is essentially been 4.5% to 5% over the past couple of years. So it will lower it to 3.8, 3.5 to 4% growth over time. Okay. So what I don't want people to think is you're like, my wages haven't kept up with inflation. That's very, very true. If you look back past the last 3 years or 4 years, if you look beyond that, it's very different than that. So generally, wage growth has been pretty healthy, and this just is going to lower it just a little bit. And then it's going to take away probably 700,000 jobs, which right now, again, we're in a very tight labor market. That could, so what those numbers are really saying is economic growth is going to moderate, but inflation is going to come down, is essentially what that's going to do, through constraining some of the fiscal impulse into the economy at a time where we are really trying to have inflation come down to the Fed's long-term 2% target. So again, not a bad outcome, less rosy than I would say from the perspective of economic growth than the Donald Trump. Now, where's the benefit here? Well, because she's raising revenue and she's constrained, she's spending about the same. Her spending isn't all that, her projections aren't all that crazy. She actually winds up adding to the debt far less than Donald Trump's programs. Okay. Again, to be fair to Donald Trump, we don't know if he's going to cut costs when he gets in the White House. If he doesn't, this is what this is assuming. Okay. So she adds far, far less to the debt. In fact, the budget model from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School of Business estimates that she'll add about 1.2 trillion to, or 1.6 trillion to the federal debt by the time she gets out of office, and Donald Trump will add about 5.7 trillion. Again, that will change if he cuts spending, but at this point, that is what they're anticipating. We are in this country getting to the point where we do have a lot of debt. The interest cost, the interest carrying cost is starting to eat up, if not all of the tax revenues, it's eating up most of the tax revenues just to pay the interest on the debt. So there is coming, the United States is coming to a point where we can't afford just to keep spending and keep spending. So, clients have asked me, well, who's the most fiscally conservative? And they're assuming it's Donald Trump. And I told them, based on these models, he's not. He is fiscally irresponsible with some of his plans. Now, to be honest, or to be fair to him, he may cut costs, which then would flip that calculus a lot. But at this point, we're just going based on what he has said publicly. Harris is not conservative either. She's adding to the debt. Okay. And she's adding a lot to the debt. So both of them are adding to the debt. It's just, what level do you want to add to the debt? I think President Trump, or former President Trump, who has indicated that he's reliant upon almost all growth to grow our way out of this issue of the debt and all those types of things. I think that can be done. I don't think his policies, particularly with the tariffs, will do that. In fact, I
Yeah.
think it'll be a net decrement to him. To
Yeah,
have those
it's hard
tariffs.
to imagine that we would grow our way out of the deficit if we're adding to it and tax revenues are cut, right? If we still have interest payments to make on all of the debt that we currently have, and we're cutting our tax revenue, which is what covers a lot of that, it's hard to, the math doesn't math very well, for, if you think about a household or even a business, right, that has debt, you can't cut revenue and pay off your debt and still pay all of your other obligations as well.
No,
Um,
without going into more debt, because
right.
effectively he's all of his plans are being funded by new debt. Okay.
Yeah.
If he doesn't cut spending. Hers, Partially it's new revenue, but partially it is also additional debt. I think both of them need to have a hard look at what some of their proposals, because one of the things I see with the Republican, with former President Donald Trump's models is he mentioned in his interview on Bloomberg, he said, well, if I give them 100% tariff, then they're going to set up a factory here in the United States. And that's great. If that's what happens, fantastic. The problem is there's something called timing in there. And you have people, there's 40 million people who are employed in the trade sector in the United States. That's a lot of people. And that's a pretty meaningful impact on the economy. So he's gonna introduce tariffs, very, very high tariffs day one, let's say, of his presidency. How long does it take for a company, an overseas company or a domestic company, to move manufacturing to the US? My guess is at the fastest they can do it, it would take 2 years before they start hiring people. And so you're going to have people get laid off from the trade, and they're going to be unemployed for a year or two until those manufacturing facilities are up and running and need them.
Yeah. Or those
So,
jobs at least will be, even if the individual people find another job in the meantime, right? Those jobs will be gone until they are
correct,
reintroduced to the economy in a different way, right? Or a
correct,
different shape. Yeah.
correct. And generally, they probably, because trade jobs and manufacturing jobs are both are pretty well compensated. So, do they have to take a step back in their family, their spending? So, generally, tariffs over a longer period of time have a deleterious effect on household spending, because one, it's inflationary from a general price level. It's inflationary across the economy. If you do it across all imported goods, which is what he has said, and then two, as people lose their jobs in the areas that are impacted with trade, their spending gets contracted. So you have this negative impact on household spending, which again, 2/3 of the US economy is based on household spending. So if you have a lot of households spending less, it tends to slow that economy pretty dramatically. So that could be a bit of a problem. Now, the other side is, Kamala Harris, we don't want her higher taxes to also restrain economic growth too much, right? If you raise revenue, but you raise it to the point where people start to game the system or implement strategies that are more impactful, or more using the tax laws to their benefit, it can backfire on you pretty heavily. So one of the things that you and I were talking about is, how would we position if Vice President Harris was elected president and all the Democrats won? I wouldn't necessarily change our portfolios that much, but I would change how we trade our portfolios a little bit. And the way I do that is because capital gains would be a higher cost, between the investment fee on top of the higher capital gains. It adds up to, I mean, for some people, almost double the cost of capital gains tax, the tax being paid on their capital gains. So we would slow down the realization of any capital gains, and we would harvest losses as they came about throughout the year much, much more quickly than we do now. Additionally, we would start putting taxable higher growth. We would allocate them into different structures. For example, if a client had a taxable trust, and they had a IRA, which is tax deferred, we would put a lot of their high growth assets into their IRA, and maybe their trust, we would minimize that and just use tax exempt bonds and tax very long-term holdings that we're going to hold for possibly until the end of their investment horizon. So there's lots of ways that investment advisors and financial planners and investment managers, lots of things we can do to help lower the cost of capital gains for our clients.
That's a really good point about where you position certain assets. Because yeah, if we think about like if someone had the forethought to heavily fund a Roth IRA, for example, right? That would be a great vehicle then to have your high growth assets because
Absolutely.
you're not going to pay taxes on any of the withdrawals.
No.
You're going to pay taxes on the way in, but you're not going to pay taxes on the way out. So yeah, let's use those assets and be aggressive with them if you have the time horizon for that, for those high growth assets. And so what I'm hearing is more like balancing the portfolios from a perspective of like long-term taxation, even more so, which is not to say that's not something we do now, because we
Correct.
do,
Yeah,
right? We
we do.
take all of that into account now. Um, but like you're saying, if we are projecting, top tax brackets to go up by, gosh, 4 or 5%, and capital gains to maybe go up 8%, from where they are right now, that's a significant leap, bigger than, marginal creep over time, right? That's like a pretty big jump. Um,
Yeah, I would also expect financial planners, estate planning attorneys, and the like, CPAs, just to start advising clients more on how to lower or to benefit from certain propensities, like for example, charity, right? Back in the 80s and 90s, when tax rates were much higher than this, a lot of clients used to set up charitable remainder trusts where they get an income flow for life. They make this big gift into this charitable remainder trust. They become what we call the income beneficiary. So they get a certain amount of income on it every year. Um, the assets grow in that portfolio over time. And then at the end of their life, that goes to the charity of their choice. The principal of that trust goes to the charity of their choice. Um, but to do that, the reason people do that is because they get a nice tax benefit up front in the first year or so. And so it's something that I haven't seen set up, as the tax rates have been pretty low, relatively speaking. But as those tax rates start to creep up, I would expect more of those type of structures to come in and to fund or to be a place where clients take advantage of or take advantage of or source their giving from.
yeah, yeah, such a good point. How policy, it doesn't necessarily um, change your trajectory all that much. But it can heavily influence, some of these other factors like charitable giving. Um, on the opposite side, I believe this was from maybe from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. There were changes to charitable giving, back in 2017, right? That actually made it less favorable for people to give. And so I remember hearing from nonprofits and organizations that were like, we are having a hard time. Like people aren't giving as much because the tax code is not as favorable to that. So it's really interesting how policy, how directly policy can affect that sector, nonprofits, charities, um, any type of, school organizations, any organization that would benefit from charitable contributions. Um, and so yeah, that would be an interesting shift to see as well. Now,
Yeah,
do you have a few more minutes, or are
I
you?
do.
You
I think
do.
so.
Okay, good.
Yeah, let me check just really quick.
No problem. Got to be respectful of everyone's time.
All right, perfect. I'm good.
Okay, so because I wanted to take that pin out and go back to the globalization piece because tariffs, we talked about tariffs a couple of times. We've talked about them before. Um, but this is one of the pieces that Trump has been most outspoken about, right? Is that, how we need tariffs and how they're going to um, punish other countries, basically, right? And from the standpoint, like an economic standpoint, what has been true throughout history is that the more individual people groups, the more we have traded with other people groups and expanded our ability to trade, more and more wealth has been created. That has been proven over literal millennia at this point. It's not just like, you know, um,
Theory. It's not a
right.
theory.
It's
It's
not
a
a
phenomenon
theory.
that we've seen happen.
And it's happened in this, century. It's happened in past centuries. It's happened since humans literally started trading with one another. And that is how, it's one of the like fundamentals of growth is that when you create new markets, that creates more opportunity. And so our globalization that we've experienced and we are continuing to find even more and more ways to globalize, and the clients that I work with, a lot of them have been able to do most of their work online. I am able to do most of my work via Zoom. Even my client base in X squared is all over the country. I don't have a border. I don't have to stay in Cincinnati to find my clients. And that has been the case for a lot of people. And there are people now, I just met a woman who lives in Thailand and we had a conversation yesterday, not to be her financial advisor, to, in case Jack is listening. That's not what that's about. But literally just met her, was a connection from someone else like, oh, you guys talk about a lot of the same things. You might, you know, enjoy having a conversation. And she works with people literally all over the globe as an individual, as one person, and has been able to, create her own individual economy in that way. And so I wanted to point out that the isolationist and protectionist tactic, like tariffs are an isolationist tactic, right? That there's a level of protectionism that comes into play when we talk about tariffs, especially on the scale that Trump is promoting or talking about, right? Like we're going to put tariffs on everything. Like, okay, that's very protectionist, and it insulates our economy rather than broadening our economy and broadening the opportunity that individuals and companies have to find those less efficient markets, right? And that's one of the ways that we do that. Um, and literally also just to find other customers, right? They're the burgeoning middle class in India and China have been a humongous explosion in like consumer spending as well. And US companies can benefit from that also.
It's funny because we talk about tariffs and people have to understand that when we're talking about tariffs, we're talking about tariffs on all imported goods. Um, I think that there is an important distinction because across the board tariffs are very, very different than individual tariffs for certain reasons. I think that there are certain strategic industries that need to be protected in the United States for national security purposes, for security of a supply chain, of a critical supply chain. I think those are two instances in which you need to have, so you protect those industries from foreign competition. But tariffs are just, they're just a gate towards doing business. They're just an impediment. They're a higher cost. When tariffs come in, when a product is imported by a U.S. company from overseas, and let's say it's a 50% tariff, that company has a decision because they're buying the goods. They're already paying the 50% tariff. They've already paid it. It's on their expenses already. And the decision they have is, one, how much can they increase the price of their goods to compensate for that increase in expenses? Or how much do they allow it to lower their profits? Well, if they lower their profits, okay, and if they're a publicly traded company, that company is now worth less, which means that stock price goes down. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Very simplistic example, so I apologize. But if they can pass it along to the customer, then they do so. And if enough companies do that, what happens is you get generalized inflation in the economy. Now, one of the things that I think is funny is companies have always had the opportunity to manufacture or to make goods in the United States. Why haven't they? Well, I'll tell you why. Because we as consumers don't want to pay the price that would be required to sell us those goods. It's too expensive in most parts of the United States to manufacture many, many goods because you, as the end consumer, don't want to pay the higher price. Because if there's one from China and there's one from Europe and there's one from the US and the US is most expensive, who are you going to buy? You're going to buy one of the other two. Okay. And so it's an interesting dynamic that people, politicians mostly, they talk about this like it's a panacea, but it's kind of a developed, wealthy economies become knowledge-based, service-based economies because it's cheaper to make it in other places. Mm-hmm. Their comparative advantage is in manufacturing. Our comparative advantage in the United States is not manufacturing anymore. Hasn't been for a long, long time. It's been technology. It's been how to design things. It's been making those things. And any of the commoditized making of production has been outsourced or farmed out to countries that are very low cost, relatively speaking. Is that a bad thing? I don't think so. Look at the U.S. economy. We have had we have been the shining star in the global economy for 100 years. So I don't think it's that big of a stretch to understand that what we've been doing has worked pretty well. Now, again, what I'm saying is, are there industries and companies that you need to protect? Yes. There are certain priorities that economic efficiencies take precedence, okay? National security is one of them. National security takes precedence over economic considerations. They just do. Mm-hmm. Similarly, I would say there are other strategic industries to the well-being of the United States citizenry. For example, I would say pharmaceuticals, to me, in my mind, because we have so many people that are relying upon medications on a daily basis, are a strategically important industry that needs to be protected and have their manufacturing done in the United States. So there's a couple of instances like that, but I would say that the prescription of globalization works. It's been proven to work over hundreds and hundreds and like you were saying, millennia. It's been proven to work. Isolationism typically does not work, and it usually ends up hurting the country that isolates the most. It hurts them the most. So take that for what it's worth. You know, uh, we'll see. We'll see how that rolls.
Yeah. The I know in my entire life, so since 1984, um, there has been, the tagline of, American made, buy American made, all of that. It's been promoted a lot throughout my lifetime. And like you're saying, it hasn't there are times in life where it's just not feasible, right? When the wages don't match, right? Like we need to buy diapers for our babies. We can't, there's not enough money. There's not enough money to buy expensive diapers. We have to go with the cheaper option, right? Whatever the example might be, people have had to make swaps, right? They've had to make choices of like, am I going to be able to provide for my family or and buy the cheaper items, or are we going to like only buy American and not be able to afford a lot of things? Um, and so, at the upper, when you're in the upper income brackets, yeah, you can make those choices. And yes, there are some things that are much higher quality, and, the term "buy once, cry once," uh, comes to mind, right? You buy higher quality items, that last longer or are meant to last a lifetime. Yes, that is absolutely a benefit. But if it takes, a month or a year of wages at a lower income bracket to buy that certain thing. Like the example, I can't remember what book this is from, but it's such a good example of boots, right? Like in, I mean, it could still apply today, but let's put this, 100 years ago. If someone makes $1,000 a year and the nice boots cost $20 that are going to last them for years, they can afford to buy the nice boots. If someone makes $100 a year, they can't afford to buy the $20 boots. So they will
Yeah.
buy the $1 boots, and they will have to keep buying the $1 boots over and over and over again because they wear out, right? They've got cardboard in the soles. They're going to fall apart. They're not going to last through the season. And so are they going to end up spending more than $20? Yeah, because they're going to have to buy new boots every single year, but they couldn't take $20 out of their 100 to buy one item in the first place, right? That's the issue at hand. So there it's an interesting, like, I want to say, like, that people try to put moral implications on it when a lot of it is economic feasibility. And when you have the money, you can make that higher moral choice, quote unquote. But when the money isn't there, you don't get that option.
Agreed. Agreed. I mean, it it's important. It's just important to understand that the reason manufacturing went away was because the United States was successful, not because we were unsuccessful. It was because we were growing our standard of living so much that it became too expensive to manufacture things. It just did. Um, so it's important that people realize that when we're talking about tariffs, um, I think that people haven't understood exactly what tariffs do, how it will impact them. Um, I was talking to someone who is involved in home building, and a lot of the lumber they buy is from Canada. Well, if that lumber has a pretty big tariff on it, it means houses just got, they're either going to stay expensive or they're getting more expensive.
Right.
So that again goes back to inflation. So inflating our way, yeah, I think people, I don't know if President Trump has or his advisors have analyzed the inflationary impact and then the deflationary impact over a longer period of time as people lose their jobs. and are unable to replace those jobs. I'm not sure that they have modeled that out or completely. I think it's not a great situation. But again, I think his other policies, I think, can be fine as long as he cuts spending by a little bit, and in those areas that are wasteful. Government is not as efficient as the private sector, so I'm sure there are many billions of dollars that can be cut.
Hmm.
And my hope is that both President Trump, if he gets elected, and President or Vice President Kamala Harris, if she gets elected, will both commit to cutting some of those inefficiencies, some of those extra costs that are in there, cutting those out, because we certainly can become a lot more fiscally conservative with the economy growing fine and inflation coming down.
Yeah. And will wrap it up with, you know, what I literally told clients that I met with today in our meeting, right? There's been uncertainty, as there always is at this time in the election cycle. There's uncertainty as to what, December is going to look like in January 2025, and we don't know, right? So there are a lot of businesses that have been on pause, waiting to purchase, waiting to move forward with contracts, waiting, to do the next thing until they know who wins the election. And the most interesting part of it, every election cycle, is that in the end, yes, policy will affect a lot of things. There are absolutely implications for this election, I do believe. And at the same time, life will go on after November
Absolutely.
5th, right? And so no matter who wins, we will still have a country in November. We will still be doing business in November and December. And we will then have the ability to say, okay, this person won. Now we can plan for XYZ, just like you said. If Trump wins, okay, here's what we're going to be looking out for. Here's how we're going to plan to make a different change when we need to. If Harris wins, okay, here's what we're going to be watching out for, and here's how we might pivot and change the way we do business. We will know. We will have the certainty that the market desires. And that's all we can really focus on at this point with 2.5 weeks left, right? So no matter what happens, we're still going to be alive. We're all still going to be here. If we're not, then we have a lot bigger problems happening in the world, right? That's always my, I guess, nihilistic joke that goes along with that. Like if shit really hits the fan, then we don't really have to worry about the stock market. So
Yeah, not really.
not really. But for, you know, 99.9999% of scenarios, everything is going to be okay. We're all still going to be alive, and we're going to figure out how to move forward no matter what. So we've just got this little bit of uncertainty left um, until we get to election day, and we'll get to figure things out from there. And I'm going to say it, I'll say it next week too, before the election. If you are able to vote in the United States, go vote. Whoever you're voting for, I don't even care. Just exercise your right to vote. If you are able to vote, it is your sacred responsibility, I believe, to utilize that to make an informed decision. I'll be super honest that I don't listen to the news. I don't watch the local news all that much. I like generally filter out a lot of the noise and just focus on what I need to focus on. But when it comes to, okay, we have elections, we have things going on, I open up my vision, or I open up my scope of vision. I take in the information I need to take in so that I can also make informed choices about who I'm voting for. Because it affects me, it affects my children, it affects things going forward. So whoever you're going to vote for, just do it. Just go vote. What do you say, Brad?
No, I would say the same thing. I mean, um, the founding fathers talked about having an informed citizenry who voted. And that is something that I think every American citizen needs to vote for whoever they're going to vote for. That's up to you. That's up to you to kind of work out who you think would be best. That's part of democracy. So please exercise that you're right there. And someone told me one time, they said, does it matter if you're in a democracy if you don't vote? You could be in a lot of other government systems if you don't vote, but if you vote, there's only one that takes citizens voting very seriously, and that's democracies, constitutional republics like we have, and the like. So I'm excited for it.
All right. Well, we'll see what happens. Today is October 17th. This is going to come out October 18th on Friday. So yeah, if you have any questions, if this has brought up any other thoughts or ideas, if you agree, if you disagree, whatever comes up, I want to hear about it. And Brad, I'm sure you would love to hear about it too, right?
Absolutely. Would absolutely love it.
So if you have any questions or any thoughts that you'd like to share, any topics that you would like for us to talk about, and we will talk about next week. We didn't get to it this week. Next week, we will talk about the good that your money can do, the impact that you can make as you make more money, create more wealth for yourself, for your family. That can absolutely extend out even further than you. This felt important to talk about for today, though. So you can reach me anytime at Hannah, HANNAH, at expansiveceo.com with thoughts or questions for the podcast. And Brad, how can people get a hold of you?
You can email me at bhaines, BHAINES, at juncturewealth.com, or give us a call at our office, 480-253-4100.
All right. Well, thank you, Brad, and thank you everyone for being here. And if you're watching on YouTube, I apologize. I had to sneeze a couple of times and blow my nose because the ragweed is crazy over here. So I'm doing my best.
That time of year.
It is. Thanks, everyone. We will see you next time. That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening, and be sure to like and subscribe. And again, if anything resonated with you from this episode, I would love to hear from you. Email me at Hannah, HANNAH, at expansiveceo.com and tell me about it. And if you're ready for your greatest expansion, you can find ways to work with me at expansiveceo.com and at x2wealthplanning.com. That's X, the numeral 2, wealthplanning.com. So until next time, remember that there is enough, you are enough, and your birthright in this lifetime is to be expansive.